Doamnelor, domnilor, unul dintre cei mai rasați, mai speciali, mai distinși muzicieni ai perioadei contemporane este invitatul meu. V-aș spune despre el deocamdată doar atât, că este un american din Buffalo, adoptat de Franța, înnobilat cu Legiunea de Onoare, ofițer al artelor și literelor. Ocupă locul lăsat vacant de Marcel Marceau în Academia franceză, iar numele lui este sinonim cu numele ansamblului muzical pe care l-a creat, Les Arts Florissants. Sunt Marius Constantinescu, iar astăzi, la ediție limitată, vi-l aduc în dar pe incomparabilul William Christie.
Perché soffriste che dalle mie bandiere ribellasse fortuna. Ah, sventurato amante, ah, infelice guerriero, lo spero aver gloria di un volto amato, e contrario l'amor, nemico il fato.
Maestro William Christie, here you are again in Bucharest after 12 years. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you again and to have you as our guest for this special edition. And I was wondering, since there are these 12 years in between our conversations, there are 12 years in which both you and your ensemble kept flourishing. Now, how do you keep both your musicians and your audience fresh?
I think it's a question of how we feel the music. Why are we making music? We're making music essentially to move, to create emotion amongst the people who are listening to us. Baroque music is like Baroque art, you know. It wants to convince. It wants to somehow make the person listening or looking, because it has to do with art as well, and sculpture as well as music, that what we're telling them is important. It's emotions, and that's what it's all about. I think that over the last, as you say, 12 years, we've been doing essentially what we've been doing for many, many years, which is essentially providing emotion through music. And that's a very nice thing to be able to say. I remind our Romanian audience that, that the first time we arrived here was in 1989.
Really? In the communist Romania?
It was several months after the execution of the Ceausescu people.
Wow.
And I was with our Florissant. We were here in the Athénée. I was staying at the Ambassade de France. And thinking back then, yes, well, I have memories of Bucharest, but I have memories certainly of the people who we've been making music for here. We did that concert, which was sacred music. And then when we came back, we did an oratorio of Handel, La Susanna.
Yes, exactly. That was in 2009. Let them eat the cake. This is one of the taglines of the movie Marie Antoinette, for which you also contributed. But I think this would also describe, in a way, the French Baroque music. I mean, thousands of layers of pinkish sweet cream, folds, lace and champagne. But let us remember that this is just the surface. What lies beneath, underneath this glaze?
Well, I think that you shouldn't tell people that it's all fluff and fun and...
It's just an image. It's just an appearance.
It's one of the nice things about
Yes.
French music, but then again you find that in other music too. You find that in Italian music. Isn't Rossini full of fluff and fun and what have you?
It is.
Yes. But I mean, obviously, there's something, that's one layer, as you say, of this great French music of the 17th or 18th century. But below that, of course, is something very serious, sometimes.
When we first met in 2009, you told me that one of your philosophies is less is more. That applies also to music, but also to your artistic beliefs, whether we talk about art, about philosophy, about life and human intellect in general. Are you as strict and disciplined in your off-stage life as well?
I think when I said less is more, I was saying essentially what my role is as a director, to make gestures, you know, in this music sometimes is rather stupid.
The conductor rhetorics, let's say.
Well, it's a question essentially, you know, if you're conducting Mahler or Shostakovich and the orchestra is 125 people, then you've got to play Tarzan. You must be Tarzan, you know. But sometimes...
You have to be larger than life.
I think the question is, can I simply, with a flick of an eye or a tiny gesture, bring people together to make music? And I think that was what I wanted to talk about. My private life and the way I make my music, I think there are similarities, yes. I would certainly not say that I'm minimalist in terms of, you know, I have a festival in my gardens.
Of course.
Which means I have a very large and very beautiful garden.
I know.
I'm very interested in other things aside from gardening and music. I love art. I've been spending the last 2 days in Bucharest essentially walking the streets, because I think it's one of the most fascinating towns in Europe. That's to say, to see the different epochs, the opulent 19th century, with architecture which you can find now almost nowhere else in Europe, which is still here. Some of it in good shape, some of it restored, some of it in rather awful shape, but it's a fascinating visual town. This I love too. I've been restoring ancient houses in France, and this is something very important for me, because I think that it has to do, again, with giving life to something which didn't have life, you see. Like the music we play, or like the buildings that we live in, yes.
I was talking the other day with Giovanni Antonini, the leader of Il Giardino Armonico, and when I asked him about Baroque music, the essence of Baroque music, he told me, well, it's all about theater.
It's even more, it's about communication, you see. There's a message. It's sometimes theater, yes. But like all Baroque art, that's to say like painting and like sculpture, like theater, spoken theatre or poetry, Baroque art wants to communicate in a rather sort of extravagant way sometimes.
Yes, larger than life.
Well, that's why the theatre is very important. Yeah.
I wonder what made a Buffalo native get drawn into this gigantic park, intellectual park called the Baroque.
I grew up with music. I was schooled with music, and very early on, thanks to recordings and thanks to concerts that I was taken to, either by my grandparents or by my parents, I knew that there was a kind of music that I liked very much, which was old music. And then when I went to school and when I went to university, of course, I was able to develop these loves, you see. So by the time when I was 18 and 19 years old, I was pretty much decided that, yes, I wanted to become a musician. I've been playing the piano and I've been playing the organ for many, many years, you see. And then when I was at Harvard and then at Yale, I became a real musician, you see. Which meant that when I was 26, I already had decided I would leave the States, at least for a while, and come to Europe and become a professional musician. I played my Beethoven and I played my Schumann on the piano and my Grieg and my Mussorgsky and my Prokofiev and what have you. But you know, it's like everything else. You learn that there are certain things that you like more in life than others. You know, and I suppose it was because, well, it was partly the fact, you know, that I was brought up in an environment where my mother conducted a choir. So that I knew what Bach and Handel and all these old people were all about, you see, because they were sung, you see.
După ce s-a specializat în istoria artei la Harvard, William Christie s-a apropiat de muzica veche tot la universitate din Ivy League, la Yale. A părăsit Statele Unite ca o formă de protest față de războiul din Vietnam, venind în Europa, mai întâi în Marea Britanie și apoi din 1971 în Franța. S-a stabilit în Franța și în 1979 a fondat aici ansamblul Les Arts Florissants din pasiune pentru muzica barocă franceză. Ansamblul este numit după opera omonimă a lui Marc-Antoine Charpentier. Us, those who live in Bucharest, sometimes tend to forget the beauty of the city, or simply to pass it by on our daily walks. But speaking about this less is more, when we talk about Baroque music, it is most often that more is more. Exactly.
That's
it's champagne, it's exuberance, it's fluffs, it's everything.
Yes.
How do you adjust to this?
Well, what I said to you, less is more, it was about the way I look, you know. Certainly, if you take a look, if you go to Austria or southern Germany, or if you go off to almost any country in Europe, what is the beginning of the 17th century like? It's exuberance, it's over the top, it's color, opulence, it's movement, the great, Yes. The great monuments that we can see, for example, are, you know, the Baroque churches in Austria, or in, you know, or even 17th century art in England. They all have this in common. It has to do with opulence and exuberance, and I would say too, a kind of optimism. Man is there, and man is doing wonderful things. Whether it be a musical composition or a painting. I mean, yes. I mean, I love the Italian chiaroscuro. I love Caravaggio.
I know, yes.
There's no one more Baroque than Caravaggio. And I love the painting schools of the 17th century in France or in England, because I think, yes, it's so optimistic, it's humanist, and I like that very much.
In your case, less is more, but going back to the Baroque music, and especially to the French Baroque music, less is more is quite seldom the approach. I mean, grand subjects, larger-than-life heroes, complicated drama.
Well, Baroque opera is very simple. You have to sort of take a look at it in a much bigger context, you see. We're talking about pieces that start essentially around 1600 with Monteverdi and in Italy. But then it starts really getting terribly important around the end of the 17th century, with opera seria, you know, and enormous spectacles, shows with elaborate costumes, yes, elaborate scenery and all that, you see. Now what is this essentially? It's humanism, essentially. It's the last gasp, essentially, of what began very early on in the Renaissance, you see, of rediscovering antiquity, classical mythology, the whole idea that somehow mankind sees itself as in a mirror. And in France and in Italy, they evolved these really quite wonderful theories, essentially. You had to be pretty strict when it came to sort of pure theatre, you see. You couldn't fool around, you know, not too many sort of marvelous things and machines that could bring gods and goddesses down on a cloud and all that. But opera was something else. You see. Opera, you could pull out all the stops. You could say, fine, we're going to have a cast of 500 people. We're going to have 3,000 costumes. We're going to have an opera that's going to last 4 hours or 5 hours. We're going to have lighting effects that'll just make people just swoon with joy. And it'll be something that people will never forget. That's what opera is all about, you see. And in this context, you see, of this kind of everything is possible. It was very expensive, obviously. But then when the king was paying for it,
Le roi danse. Donnez la plus belle musique du monde au dieu Jupiter, maître de l'univers.
Now you are talking about your garden, we're going to talk about that of course, but also I would take this idea of blossoming, of vegetal and perpetual renaissance, because we have a garden, you have also les arts florissants. We are still in this area. So this idea of perpetual nature renaissance seems to be surrounding you. What is it about the flower and about this rebirth that really entices you, challenges you?
Well, I think it has to do essentially with seeing life begin. you plant a bulb of tulip or narcisse, you see, in November. And you're not going to see anything until maybe March or early April. And then you're rewarded with something which is rather important, which is a flower. Or I've been creating a garden now since 1986.
Yes.
And what do I see now? Well, I see, especially in the formal parts of my garden, an art of topiary, that's to say, clipping trees to make them into, essentially, shapes that man has decided to make them into. In other words, it's man and nature working together. I like that too. And I like that very much. It's a bit like music. Or it's a bit like an ancient old house that's about to fall down. The music we've discovered sometimes has been music that has been forgotten, unloved. Or music even worse that has been lost. Or music that's just simply been on the shelves of a library and not played or not sung or not heard since it was put in the library. And this all has to do essentially with la floraison. Yes. And I think that's one the reason why nature is so extraordinary, of course, is that it's repetitive and you see it on a much quicker level.
Does your exterior garden resemble the inner one?
That's for others to decide. But I think that if I were to take a look at self, look at self in the mirror, I'd say, well, yes, yes, yes.
And I met Chaban in Paris, you see, because he'd been working on, I can't remember what it was it Traviata?
I think it was Lucia.
One of the big 19th century
Yes.
sort of war horses. And we met, and he, you see, it's a question of feeling very often, you know. I mean, there are directors you meet once and you say, oh no, never, you know. And then directors you meet and you have a drink, or you have a cup of coffee, you talk, and you discover that you have a feeling.
And you finally get along.
Yes, that's very important. Because as you know, there are many productions in opera where it becomes a Berlin West and a Berlin East.
Yes.
You know, between the pit, the orchestra pit, and the stage, where the conductor and the stage director hate each other. And there's open warfare, you know. There's blood on the stage, you know.
And there's a fight whose point of view values more. Is it music? Is it direction?
And Almere, I thought was very interesting because he wanted to learn about Baroque theatre. He obviously had an intellectual knowledge, you see. But it was very good. We had a very good time, actually.
Now, who are you according to your garden, which is a garden that you have created from scratch, actually? It's not an ancient garden that you gave a new life to, but created it from nothing, basically.
Yes, and that was what has been my desire, my wish, ever since I've been a young man. When I moved to France, I said to myself, eventually, I'm going to restore a house, or perhaps something even bigger, perhaps a village, perhaps something. But I'm going to also sort of give people an idea of music that they've never heard, or we haven't heard for hundreds of years. But I want to create a garden. I want to create something to just essentially show the world who comes to my garden what I love in terms of nature and in terms of seeing things. So it's not a severe classic garden. In fact, many of the French come and say, "Oh, but of course, it's not really a jardin fait du grand siècle. You know, you've broken all the rules." And I say, "Yes, I've broken them, but that's because they don't really. The rules are less important than me expressing myself."
What is it, the Baroque music? A garden, a library, an amusement park, or a vista towards one of the most enlightened periods in human intellects?
Well, I think you've said everything I would say.
Okay. So coming back to your garden, but also mirroring it to the inside garden that you have, is it a garden that is alive no matter the season, whether it's winter, whether it's fall, it has always some sort of life breath within?
Of course. But also it's a garden that I've created to share with people, which is very important for me. That's to say, I share it because the garden is open to the public. But also the garden is a place where we make music. But there are moments when I say, oh gosh, now I'm all by myself. And I can live in my garden with just myself. And that's called la solitude. And that's something which I think is very important too, in art and in terms of just human nature. The ability to say, fine, now we shut the door, or we close the window, you see. And our gardens are very good for this as well, because I can enjoy them in winter, and I can enjoy them in summer, as well in the spring and the fall. And yes. So essentially, it's a place where I can be happy with people, but also immensely, intensely happy by myself.
your recording chapter of your career is quite important, but I was wondering, when you are in the recording studio, is it difficult for you and for your ensemble to find and to recuperate that excitement that characterizes a live performance?
Sometimes, but sometimes not. I think my best recordings are recordings that, where, as you say, we've had that kind of wonderful moment of la grâce, as the French say.
Yes. What replaces the audience in front of you when you are just with your mics and with your sound engineers?
Imagination, enthusiasm.
Puțini sunt muzicienii a căror carieră să fie atât de influentă și de respectată astăzi precum cariera lui William Christie. Lui se datorează în bună măsură resuscitarea interesului față de muzica veche în rândul unor noi categorii de public, datorită originalității, prospețimii și autorității sale. În plus, William Christie este un adevărat estet al timpurilor noastre, a cărui fiecare felie de viață este de fapt o celebrare a frumuseții. De pildă, grădinile domeniului său din Tire, în Franța, au fost în 2006 incluse pe lista monumentelor istorice din patrimoniul francez. Now, talking about this solitude, we've all had our share of solitude during these last already 2 years, unfortunately. How was it for you all this time?
I'm going to shock you.
Please do.
Saying that I came back from New York on the 14th of March. New York had a meltdown the day after. Everything closed. I went down to my country house, knowing that I'd be there perhaps for a very long time. And we went through confinement. We went through moments of, you know, essentially life was very different. But I realized that over a period of several months, music, I was playing music with my harpsichord by myself. And then we started calling each other up, my fellow musicians and myself, or writing emails saying, well, we've got to reinvent ourselves. We can't now, we have no idea how long this is going to last, this pandemic. So we did reinvent ourselves. There were many moments where I was recording the Stabat Mater of Pergolese, and just the organ part. And then it was sent off electronically, of course, to New York, where they were one of the singers. And then it was sent off to Marseille, where there was the second singer. And then it was sent off to Paris, where the two violin players were. And I thought to myself, this is so awful, but it's what we have to do. But then again, it really wasn't that awful, you see. And then I had a stint in Vienna at the opera, where essentially we were supposed to have rehearsals and then 8 performances of Rameau's Parte. We knew that something would happen. And indeed, we didn't have any performances whatsoever. We had 2, what the French call captation. We had 2 filmings, you see. And the same thing in Paris at the opera later on. But to get back to my country house and me and COVID, it was the first time in my life, since I've owned that house and made my garden, that I could actually see seasons come and go. It was the first time in my life where there were no airplanes in the sky. It was the first time in my life when I could smell air and say to myself, but there's much less pollution, even in the countryside. And then there were wonderful moments where I could see what I had planted in spring flowers. I could actually see all of my tulips and all of my narcissi and all the things that sometimes I had missed because I was in Bucharest or in
or somewhere else,
Nagasaki,
yes,
you know, or
right.
in Beijing, you see. So essentially, I said to myself, I'm not going to say this was an awful moment. It's a moment that I lived through. I was very fortunate because I was able to get vaccinated, but I also was very fortunate because none of my immediate group of friends or family were affected, which was an enormous amount of luck. Really.
Yes, yes. What was your intellectual survival kit in this time?
Well, it was that actually. It was being able to essentially have long moments of reflection. I read a great deal. I worked on scores. I made a recording, a record recording, which was very good. And I made a number of visits after a number. Well, we started in the spring. It was very difficult. But by the fall and the early winter, I was already traveling to Vienna, traveling to Paris, what have you. So.
We have started this interview talking about a movie. I would like to end it with a movie too. What idea, image, figure of sound of the Baroque era would you like to see it transposed into a movie?
Well, I think the closest thing we've ever gotten to this kind of approach now was in the 30s and early 40s, of course, in Hollywood, you know. If there were ever someone who wanted desperately to arrive at what the French call le merveilleux, or the, you know, would be Walt Disney, certainly. And I'd love to have seen, and in fact, I think some of the later Walt Disneys are absolutely fantastic.
Tonight you'll prop your feet up, but for now let's eat up. Be our guest, be our guest, be our guest, please be our guest.
You seem to always be on tour. Like you said, always be somewhere else than your country house. But when you are there, when you are home, how does a perfect evening look like?
There is no perfect evening, I think, really. It depends on so many things. It depends on the weather. It depends on light. It depends on what's growing outside. It depends if it's cold in the house or warm. Do we have fires? Do we, you know, it depends on company. When I'm alone, it's a different thing than when I'm with 5 or 6 or 10 people. So essentially, it's a place that I think about because it's my home, you know. And when I'm away from the home, yes, I think about my home because it's a place that holds me like this, you see.
Now, last time we've met, you told me that France turned its back to some of her geniuses, such as Rameau or Berlioz, but your work stands as a diplomatic act in order to restore such beacons of humanity to the public perception?
I think I don't want to be a missionary, and I don't want to be someone who's going to save something, but I do, yes. Have I played my part in making music or culture different, or at least sometimes better, in France? Yes, I think so, yes. Do I have satisfaction when I'm told that, yes, you started something which is very important? Yes, of course I do. Yes.
We are just minutes away from your concert in Bucharest, so this is my last question, don't worry. I was going to ask you, if the concert goes well, and I certainly hope it will.
Will you be there?
Yeah, of course I will be. How do you reward yourself after a good concert?
I think it's a question of sharing the joy with others. We are a family. And I think that's one of the most important things that I could say about the Art Florissant. Contrary to many orchestras or many groups of musicians, there is a strong emotional and intellectual bond among us. And I think one of the nicest things is that it seems to just continue with different generations. I've just done a recording with someone who is 52 years younger than I am. And it's what an extraordinary sense. A concert tonight, if it goes well, first of all, I'll let everybody know who was involved that I think it was pretty successful and enjoyable.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for very good questions. And I like your tie too.
Thank you. I also have to host the live from the Palace Hall tonight, so this is why I'm so dressed up.
Live from the...
Yes, the live from the bigger hall, the closure of the festival with Concertgebouw, actually.
Who's singing or playing?
It's Concertgebouw with Daniel Harding.
Oh, well, you must give Daniel my very best.
Of course I will.
And you can give the Concertgebouw people my very best too.
Okay. Why not?
I conducted them just a few months ago doing the Johannes Passion.
Great. Yes. Thank you once again.
My pleasure.
Doamnelor și domnilor, o nouă ediție limitată se închide aici. Sunt Marius Constantinescu, trăiți nelimitat!